the most unusual experience of my ministry life anyway. I'm grateful that you're watching at this time, and it really means a lot. I don't know about you, but I'm already missing normal so much. I really just wish it was normal right now. I wish that we were at Napier Boys High School Hall right now. I wish that we'd just done all that mission to pack everything in. I wish that we're in the middle of our series, Words from the Cross, which we are going to have to cycle around to at some point. Obviously, we're heading into Easter. Oh, there's so much that's changed. I wish that we were looking forward to going into our church camp this coming weekend. It was meant to be, and yet here we are in this whole new world. And you know, it's interesting. I've been reading a lot and engaging with different pastors and different scholars and stuff this week. And I was listening to a really fascinating conversation with the finest, I think, New Testament scholar N.T. Wright this week, and he was saying, you know, that back in the day, in the Middle Ages, they used to have these, you know, they had plagues and stuff. And so people that had the plague, they couldn't come and worship inside the church for fear of contaminating everyone else. And so what they built in certain cathedrals are these kind of peepholes, these lines of sight, so that people, even though they couldn't touch, they could still watch and participate in the service and in the Eucharist and in the liturgy. And so that's kind of what we're doing. Peephole's a weird word, it sounds weird, but I just thank you that you're watching through your little digital peephole at this time, and that you are still engaged. And just looking now, you know, we've got nearly 100 people that are watching this at this time, and that represents a bunch of families, different people as well. What a lovely thing that we can gather together. And I pray that actually one of the things that comes out of this is that we have a deeper gratitude and appreciation for the gathered church. We're forced into being a scattered church right now. And I think it's very easy to take the gathered church for granted, but I really pray that this will be a time where we just really value the gathered church. And so we are a resilient people, right? We're going to get through this, but right now we're trying to adjust to this new normal. You know, one of the things you've probably heard is one of the best things you can do for your kids, and probably us big kids as well, is to get into some new routines. We personally in this house have struggled to do that, as me and Jen have worked full-time plus and more, trying to just stay on top of all the different things as we change kind of gears with the church. You know, we're trying to build these new rhythms as a church. So again, thank you that you are watching right now. You know, don't you feel jealous that there are probably a small percentage of people that are really just enjoying this right now? I mean, everyone's probably going to get over it, but right now there's certain people that are probably just really enjoying it. You know, I'm part of a home theatre group forum on Facebook, and so everyone has been posting what they're doing in lockdown. You know that they reckon between 1.7 and 2 billion people are going through what we're going through right now. This is a really universal experience, and so there's some guys, particularly those that are empty nesters and their kids have left home, who are just loving the opportunity that they don't have to go to work and they get to, you know, use their home theatre, and so there's a few people out there, you know, maybe some old farmer or hippie that's living by the river that just gets to fish all day now or whatever. There's a small number of people that probably really enjoying this, but you know, the vast majority of us, I think, probably if we're honest, are struggling with it, and some of us are really lonely. You know, you're really lonely already, and you're looking at the fact that, well, whatever, day 3 I think it is now, and it's like, and for our over 70s it's been longer than this already, and you're just feeling desperately lonely. And you know, we're social creatures. We're actually wired to be in connection with one another, and so this isolation is really full on. And so some of you guys are feeling really lonely. Some of you guys wish that you could feel lonely because you've got, in our case, 3 little monsters running around making noise, and now a kitten, you know, and it's just constant, and it's like, oh Lord have mercy. Some of us wish that there was a lot more noise, and some of us are wishing there was a lot less noise. I think, I don't know how you guys have been feeling around this week, but you know, we've just been feeling really tired, and it's brought back a lot of memories, I think, of the Christchurch earthquakes when we were going through that experience, and you just feel exhausted. And I think it's just all the news and stuff, and all the just the weariness of just how much, you know, there's a lot of adrenaline that's been in our systems, and we can feel really tired. the reality is this is the beginning of this experience. We're not in the middle of it or near the end of it. This is the beginning of a whole new experience. And it's really exposed how fragile our lives and our systems, the entirety of our systems really are. Mark Sayers wrote a book called Reappearing Church, which I talked a whole lot about last year. And quite prophetically in this book, he said this. You may not be able to see this on your screen. You may have to zoom in. I've just realized the slides are way too small. But anyway, I'll read it out. He says this: the secularist life script in which humans attempt to live without having to confront the great questions of life creates insulation against faith. If we endured a global flu pandemic like the one in the early part of the 20th century that killed millions of people across the world, how we view and process our personal potentials and possibilities would be deeply, deeply shaken. And that's so true. We are confronting the reality of how fragile our economic systems are. In many countries in the world, just been overwhelmed in terms of the health systems, and also the economic realities in terms of what does this mean for our future? What does this mean for my job? All of these dreams that we may have, all of a sudden, it's just like it's all up in the air. We don't know how this thing is going to play out. This young person went viral online. There's been so much news, you may not have seen it, but this, in the States, there's these guys partying during spring break when they're meant to be in lockdown. And this young person hit international news when he's like, well, if I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, this isn't going to stop me from partying. And this goes viral because it's just so insensitive and so selfish. And later, this poor young person apologized and he says, our generation may feel invincible, but we have a responsibility to listen and follow the recommendations given to our communities. But that line, our generation may feel invincible. And it's like, man, all of a sudden, hey, you're not. We are not invincible. And so this is changing, I hope, the way that we see the world. I really hope this, across our societies and around our world, it changes the dependence we have on certain systems. We are realizing we cannot depend on them. And so I want to, in this little chat, ask some of the deeper questions about what God is doing in the midst of all of this. Like, where is Jesus in this? And how does this event, this global event, sit in our framework as followers of Jesus? Because whenever something like this happens, we will try to understand what God is doing in the midst of it. And, we went through this in the Christchurch earthquakes. We had people saying all sorts of things about what they thought God was doing. And a lot of it was centered around God's judgment for people. Often, we can look at Old Testament statements by the prophets and go, oh man, that's maybe what God is doing right now. And it's natural, like it's actually normal, like we want to try and understand what is happening here and what is God doing in this. But I want to present what I think is just a really biblical understanding of who God is and how God works in the world, particularly through these sort of moments. And that's the whole idea of today's chat, is that we will just have a clarity, I hope, around what I think God is doing in the midst of all of this. So the first thing that we've got to understand is that if we want to understand firstly who God is in the midst of this, we have to look at Jesus. It's the only place we can start. And the reason we start there, the Bible helps us with this in Hebrews 1. These are some of my favorite scriptures. In Hebrews 1, it says this: in the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. Listen to this. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. I mean, Colossians 1 verse 15 says the same thing. The Son is the image of the invisible God. If we want to know what God is like, we look at Jesus. That is who we look to. We look at Jesus. We don't begin with the prophets. We don't begin with Old Testament stories. If we want to know what God is like, we look to Jesus. And this is such great news. In Matthew 17 verse 4 here, this is on the Mount of Transfiguration, or Mount Tabor, I think it's called. And you've got Jesus who's transfigured into glory, and Moses and Elijah join him on this mountain, and Peter, James and John, who represented the church at that time, see this unfold. And Peter, James and John are like, oh man, this is incredible. We should build 3 shelters that are kind of like the same. One for the Old Testament prophet Elijah, he represents the prophets. One for Moses, the one who gave us the law, and one for Jesus. And God says, no, that they're not at an equal level. He says, this is my son whom I love. Listen to him. He's the one you listen to. If you want to know what Jesus is like, what God is like, we look to Jesus. And so Jesus preaches and teaches and lives out what God's heart was all along throughout the whole Old Testament. And this is actually what God's heart was. We see it in Jesus. Love of enemies, blessing those that persecute, turning the other cheek, the radical love of the sinner. This is what God is like, and we see this in Jesus, and that is such great news for a sinner like me. I'm so glad that that's who Jesus is. And so therefore, any time that we take a natural disaster and declare it that it is God's judgment, we are contradicting Jesus' teaching, and I believe the heart and the nature of God. Jesus didn't just teach this, he lived it out supremely. He lived out love towards those that hurt him, betrayed him, and rejected him. And this is why the cross is the supreme reflection of God's heart. He could have gone down that route of judgment and commanded angels to slaughter all those that did this to God himself, but instead he chose the way of self-sacrificial love. And something very powerful happened on that cross. In Galatians 3:13 it says, Christ has rescued us from the curse pronounced by the law when he was hung on the cross. He took upon himself the curse for our wrongdoing. For it is written in the scriptures, cursed is everyone who is hung on a tree. And so Steve Graham says this, we have to be very careful how we read the Old Testament prophets this side of the cross, where amongst other things, God's judgment was taken upon himself in an incredible act of self-sacrificial love. So hear me loud and clear, because there are too many other voices that will probably say the opposite. The coronavirus is not a sign of the end times, and it is not a sign of God's judgment because of the sin in the world. That has been taken care of 2,000 years ago on a cross in Calvary, and we rejoice and we worship the Lord in the midst of that. God is love, and Jesus shows us, and the cross is the final word in God's reconciling work towards the world. And when Jesus says it is finished, he meant every word of it. It is finished. So, well, how do we interpret these sorts of moments, well, biblically, in the midst of the suffering and the confusion and the sadness of what is going on in the world at this time? And so to do that, I believe that we're best to look at Romans chapter 8. Paul's writing in Romans chapter 8. I think it gives us the greatest biblical hook to hang our questions on and to help us have a lens for how to view these moments. And the beauty about this is it keeps on hooking back into the life of Jesus. So in the book of Romans, Paul systematically outlines his understanding of the gospel, the story of what God has done to redeem his world. And in the middle of this, in Romans chapter 8, we have this climactic statement about a theological vision for Christian living. So Paul gives us, what I mean by that, Paul gives us a picture of what the Christian life looks like now between the past finished work of Jesus and the final future hope that we have in him. And he specifically addresses the issue of present suffering, of living with suffering. So let's have a look at this passage. So Romans 8, we're going to have a look at a whole bunch of things here, but let's have a look. Romans 8 verse 18 says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. And so this immediately is an amazing statement. Not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed, in us. And so Paul's perspective immediately is that these sufferings take place in a greater story of what God's going to do in us in terms of the glory that's going to be revealed. And now when Paul talks about suffering, he has every right to talk about sufferings. Paul's sufferings were intense. He has every right to go, man, these present sufferings, and he should use that word. In 2 Corinthians 11, he gives us a hint about some of the things that we've gone through. He says, I've worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. How's your week going? It's like, this is great. 5 times he received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. That's suffering. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger in rivers. I've been in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at the sea, in danger from false believers. I've labored and toiled and often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. He goes on and on, like some brutal suffering that Paul has gone through. And I don't want to minimize what we're going through. I want to speak to our suffering today. But Paul's saying the present suffering that we're going through is not worth even comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. And then he goes on to say in verse 19, for the creation waits an eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom of into the freedom and glory of the children of God. So Paul speaks of today's suffering in context of the hope that we have, that one day the creation will be released from the decay. This passage, and we've talked about this a lot, speaks to this hope of a renewed, restored earth when Jesus comes again in glory. Verse 22. We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we eagerly await for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Again, I've talked about this a lot. So then Paul's talking about the redemption of our bodies. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he talks about the resurrection of our bodies, which again is this great hope that we have. Jesus is the first fruits of this, that we will one day be resurrected in glory. The ancient creeds say we believe in the resurrection of the dead. Hallelujah. But in this hope we have been saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. We don't see this resurrection body. We don't see this renewed earth, but we have a hope for it and we wait for it patiently. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. Now, what's interesting about this passage is that there are 3 times that Paul talks about groaning taking place. The first is in creation, and Paul uses the metaphor of childbirth. Now, my sister welcomed into the world her first baby last Sunday or Monday, I think it was, and a very unusual experience, obviously, with all this lockdown and stuff going on. But oh man, childbirth is not fun, eh, Jen? It's a horrible, I mean, Paul's using intentionally a metaphor here, saying like creation is groaning like it's in childbirth. Now, it's tough for the girls as they go through childbirth. Boys, I just want to talk to you. It's also tough for you, isn't it? It's real tough trying to support your wife through childbirth and through the groaning and whatnot there. So, you know, I don't think we get enough credit for what we go through when it comes to childbirth. But, you know, I'm the one preaching today and I can't hear all the boos and heckles. So, anyway. Boo. All right. There's a groaning in the world. There's a groaning in the world. It's like this is not the way it's meant to be. It's out of kilter. There's this groaning. But the childbirth metaphor also again points to a new birth, that there is new hope, that there's new birth coming. The second group of people that Paul talks about groaning and suffering are the people of God. It's normal and it's right for us to feel this groan of like, oh, this is not the way it is meant to be. And I know in the midst of this isolation, some of you are feeling it so deeply right now. And there's this internal groan like, oh, this is not the way I want it to be. The isolation from others. And I want to encourage you to let it out. I'm actually going to preach at some point in the next couple of weeks about lament, about the biblical place of lament. We have lost in the Western world in the pursuit of comfort, and because we have so not used to suffering, we've lost the beautiful gift that lament is, which is the cry to God. This is not right. This is just painful. I remember growing up in South America, and just there in the slums there's just like, there's a lot of joy paradoxically, but just deep groaning about the struggle and the suffering of life. I was talking to one of our saints in our church, Terry, last night, and his beautiful wife Harvey is in hospital, and he can't see her for 4 weeks, and her mental health's just a bit all over the show, and so he's on the phone to her, but I'm like, Terry, how are you doing? And he's like, I'm just grieving. And it's this groan, you know. Saw stuff come up on Facebook. Craig Rawcliffe's family members at Nice Gen that has, it was a young mother, cancer that's moved into her bones. And you read that and it's just like this groan. It's like, no, this is not. And before we even begin praying for healing or anything like that, let's groan. It's not an unbiblical thing to do, to groan, to feel the pain, to feel the loneliness, to feel the grief even of these moments. And so groan. And thirdly, where's the God in the midst of this? So it says with the Spirit, He is groaning as well, joining in with the cries of creation and the cries of His people. Steve Graham says this, Paul says the sign of the Spirit is not some superficial triumphalism, but a deep groaning and frustration at the brokenness and pain of our world. You know, being filled with the Holy Spirit doesn't mean that everything's just rocking and rolling. Sometimes there's this deep groan. We join with the Holy Spirit in groaning for the pain and brokenness in our world. And so listen, friend, suffering is part of our world. And the Bible doesn't give us some clear little description as to why. A world without suffering and groaning is not a world that's described by Paul. The Bible doesn't answer the question as to why suffering happens. Jesus, interestingly, had opportunities to do this. And Matthew 7, one of my favourite scriptures because of what, and we actually just sung about this before. Jesus says this in Matthew 7, 24 to 27. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against his house. But it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. And then he says, the people that don't put these words of mine into practice, the rain comes, the streams rise, the winds blow against his house, and it falls with a great crash. Now notice the exact same language is used by Jesus for both those that listened to his message and those that didn't listen to his message. And especially in the point of Jesus' little parable here is listen and applied, and those that listened and didn't apply. So whether you are in the category of I've listened to you, Lord, and I've applied your teaching to my life or not, the streams are still rising, the storms are still coming, and the wind is still beating against your house. And it's not that God sent them or the devil sent them. Jesus doesn't even go there. They just came. And so the difference is, though, if your entire basis for the foundation of your life is a stable world built on the systems of this world, economic, governmental, health systems, and they fail, you're thrown around and you desperately struggle. But if your life is built on the worldview and the teachings and the practices of Jesus, the storms come, but you still have an inner peace. You are not as shaken. I want to make that clear. We're going to be shaken, but not as shaken. The sufferings and storms are going to come. What is interesting is that the Bible is very clear about the foolishness of religious people associating associating suffering with God's anger or judgment. The whole book, the whole book of the Bible is dedicated to this, the book of Job. The book of Job is looking at unhelpful religious people who presume that suffering must be happening because of our actions. There's a whole book in the Bible that is dedicated to trying to bring some clarity to us religious people about pronouncing suffering as something that God's done in anger or in judgment. We need to take that lesson to heart, say a lot less about what God is doing in this, and lean into saying that God is present through it. N.T. Wright gives a really biblical little worldview here when he, and this was in an interview that I was talking about earlier, he says, we've forgotten that things like plagues and famines and earthquakes is simply part of the way the world is. We have got used to thinking that if anything goes wrong, there is probably a pill for it, or somebody is responsible to ensure that we don't have to suffer and we'll get better soon. But actually most of history has not been like that. And this has not been seen as a problem by Christians. They did not think, oh my gosh, God's lost control, this is a sign of the end times. Throughout church history, the worldview has been, it's just, this is normal life. And what actually happened is that the Christians took these events, these things, as a call to care for people. That was how Christians interpreted these events. And so Paul goes on in Romans 8, he says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those he justified, he also glorified. And just remembering, just a quick side note, when we talk about predestination, we learnt about this as we went through the book of Ephesians. It's predestined for mission, it's not predestined for salvation, that other people don't get to be saved. This is predestined to represent Jesus to the world. And so he says this here, that God works through all things. He doesn't cause all things, he works through all things for the good. And so there are things that will come through this that God will use to bring just great good, particularly in our lives if we allow him to just shape us in the midst of our suffering at this time. I look back on my life and some of the dumbest things I've done have been real gifts actually, because there's always, and often you know what God does is he actually wants to shape our character. He's so into shaping our character. And so I look back in my life and I've done so many silly things and I've hurt people and said things I regret. And all the way through it, the Lord is inviting me to, he wants to work for good through this, often through creating humility in my heart and a soft heart that is willing to repent where I've done things wrong. There's so much I still don't understand. Why did my friend die of cancer? I don't get that. How are you redeeming that, Lord? I've got these questions, but through all of these different times in my life, I've seen God's loving fingerprints through it all. And the pinnacle of this thought of redeeming even the worst situations is the cross. This is the place where human rebellion and demonic hatred meet, and somehow God turns it into the salvation of the world. And so this isn't some shallow triumphalism, but it's a deep and painful yet glorious mystery of how God redeems and restores all things. So I've been thinking about, like, what are some of the good things that God may want to do through this, both in us and through us. And after we finish today, I'd love you just to be meditating on this. As I said earlier, I pray that God works for good by giving us a renewed appreciation for the gathered church that perhaps we've taken for granted. One of the things I think God may want to cultivate in us is to really embed a practice of gratitude, because we live in really anxious times. John Mark Comer said that gratitude is an antidote for anxiety. And why? Because anxiety is grasping for control of what we do not have in the future, and gratitude is giving thanks for what we do have in the present. It changes our focus. As I said, I think that the Lord wants to teach us as a church to rediscover what it looks like to lament. In a Western world largely insulated against suffering, this will be an opportunity to discover the very Christian, very biblical practice of lament. I believe that through this, that we are to embrace the mystery that is suffering, and rather than trying to find answers, to just sit with it. I believe that this will be a catalyst to care for one another. At this stage, I think it means phone calls and Zoom, small groups connecting. In time, it may mean us sitting with the sick. Some incredible stories already coming out around the world, not just of Christians, but of all sorts of people who are caring. There's caregivers here in New Zealand that are choosing to be isolated and voluntarily locking themselves down with patients that have dementia for the entirety of this lockdown. There was a beautiful story that came out from Italy of a priest there who had his own private ventilator because of his health, but chose to give that up to a younger person so that they would survive the coronavirus, and subsequently he passed away. There are so many things that the Lord will want to do, beautiful things that works for good through all of this. And there are lots of things that you could think about, I'm sure. I think it'd be a good exercise. Lord, what are you going to do working for good through this? And Paul in this passage points to a people that through suffering become a little bit more like Jesus. He says, conform to the image of his Son. the suffering servant. Through this, we have an opportunity to be closer to Jesus. My friend, I was texting my friend Nick, who's preaching this morning at a Vineyard Church, and he says, I think this is going to be a moment where people encounter the love of God in a new way, in a radical way, a kairos moment, a new sense of engaging with the presence of God. So maybe as we just look at all the options available to us, that would fall in love with God in a whole new way as we look to Him to be our peace in the midst of all that's going on, to sit with Him as we rest in His presence, and to, in time, imitate Jesus and His compassion and His love. Romans 8 finishes with this: who shall separate us from the love of God? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We're considered as sheep to be slaughtered. What a motivational talk. Thanks, Paul. He says, no, in all these things we're more than conquerors through Him who loved us. For I'm convinced that neither death nor life, nor angels nor demons, nor the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Oh, what a great, great passage to hold on to at this time. We're more than conquerors, not because we don't go through suffering. We aren't more than conquerors because, life is sweet for all of us. We are more than conquerors because in spite of our suffering, in spite of our isolation, in spite of our loneliness, in spite of our grief, we will still know the love of God, because nothing can separate us from the love of God. Paul knew this. He knew it in prison. He knew it when he was facing impending execution at times in the New Testament. We see, and he's just experiencing the love of God at this time. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. We can go through all of this, and the difference between Christians and those that don't stay close to Jesus isn't, what is God doing and who deserves this. The only difference is that we get to navigate it with the love of God as a daily experience. And this is what I long for any of you watching, that if you don't know Jesus, that you would say, come into my life. I want to know your presence, so that you can know the love of God, of your Creator, as we go through all of this. So what is the message of Romans 8? We live in a world of groaning and pain. We can discover God at work in the transformation of His people in and through it all, and we can have confidence that nothing can separate us from the love of God. We sit with these tensions of suffering and lament and grief, and simultaneously hope, gratitude and peace as we sit with Jesus in the midst of it. This very passage that I've read was bookmarked with the hope of new creation and new bodies, and the love of God, and in the middle of it is this groaning and longing that we carry. This God of love is with us, and He is the God who suffered. We're going to take communion in a second as we finish. But this lovely quote by John Stott that I just think is so powerful and helpful as we go into communion. He says this: I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through His hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged into God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside His immunity to pain. He entered into our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of this. There is still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross, that symbolizes divine suffering. God has entered into our pain. He is the God who has wept. He is the God who feels grief. He is the God that felt loneliness. And He is Emmanuel. He is the God that is with us right now. And so I pray for you. I pray that you may never lose the hope of glory. I pray that you would know His love, and in the midst of this pain and suffering and isolation and loneliness and the disappointments of this world and the uncertainty of our economic future, I pray that God would work for good through it and do something incredibly beautiful in your heart at this time. So we're going to take communion as we finish. If you haven't prepared the elements, that's absolutely fine. You can either do that once we finish the live stream, or I will take it, and I will take it on your behalf. And so we come to the table this morning And guys, I miss you so much, and I'm glad that we can gather around the table together at this moment. We gather around the table, and it's not the table of the church. We don't have a gathered church right now, but thankfully it's the table of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's been made ready for those who love the Lord a little and those who would like to love him more. Everyone is invited to take a seat at this table, the certain, the uncertain, the faithful and the doubters. And so I invite you to come this morning, you who have much faith and you who have little. You who have followed faithfully and you who have tried and failed. There is always a space for you at this table. So come not because of your own goodness, but because of the goodness of God. Come in this moment and meet the risen Christ. Come and eat from the tree of life rediscovered. Open your heart to Jesus in this time and receive the salvation of God. For Jesus is the bread of life, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And so in this moment we come to where heaven and earth overlap, the table of the Lord, and we receive the life of Christ as our own.